Module 1, Overview of Sociological Inquiry. Much of what I'll say in this video we went over in class this past Wednesday. How do we come to know, how do we come to understand sociological phenomena? Of course, we're interested in studying the collective nature of human life. We're interested in societies, groups, organizations, how one's social location is affected and affects how we think, act, and feel, and all sorts of questions like this. We're interested in describing, of course, phenomena. We're interested in describing, for example, how income or wealth is distributed in a given society, or why societies are particularly prone, certain societies may be particularly prone to criminal activity, whereas others may not be so. We're interested, of course, in understanding through explanation as well. In fact, that's really the ultimate goal, I think, of any science, is to answer the question of why and how. We use the scientific method in doing this. And of course, there's several basic principles related to the scientific method. One concern is with data and evidence. We're concerned with empirical verification. The empirical world is that which can be sensed directly through our senses or through instrumentation. And we're concerned with evidence, of course, in science. We're concerned with deriving general understanding, going beyond a single case. For example, if interested in studying revolution, we would certainly not stop with our understanding of one revolution, such as the French Revolution. We'd want to have a general knowledge that would incorporate any number of revolutions in terms of causes, the course of events, consequences, and so forth. We're interested in deriving understanding, and we understand that it's probabilistic or likelihoods that we're going to be talking about, not absolutes and certainties. To derive valid scientific understanding, we need to be objective, limiting our biases, our prejudices. It's understood that scientific findings are tentative. They're not absolute. They're not binding for all time. They may be radically modified or indeed overturned down the line. We're also interested in being precise and detailed and conveying to consumers of research how we did the studies that we do, how we conceptualized phenomena, how we asked our questions, how we collected our data. So precision and detail are certainly basic as well. So the main goal of research is to derive or devise useful explanations. And we devise useful explanations through theory. Sociological examples of theory are certainly plentiful, and over this semester we'll be talking about many sociological theories. One very helpful one to understand population change that we'll be addressing in a couple of weeks is called the theory of the demographic transition. Trying to understand why people become deviants is certainly helped by having an understanding of anomic theory, a theory devised by a sociologist named Robert Merton many decades ago. Theory and observation are certainly linked together. We observe data, we observe behavior, we collect evidence, and from that we begin thinking about answering such questions as why and how. And of course, those questions of why and how, then we must further address by collecting additional data to more clearly understand a phenomenon. Theory defined We can think of it as explanation, certainly at a basic level. We can say that theory answers the question of why or how, but more formally, let's simply call theory or define theory as a set of interrelated propositions that collectively attempt to explain variation in a phenomena or class of events. It's kind of a textbook definition, a set of interrelated propositions which are trying to answer the question why or how. So a theory is a set of interrelated propositions, but what is a proposition? It's simply a statement of a relationship between two or more concepts. But then you might ask, what is a concept? A concept is an idea, an image, an abstraction that we carry around in our mind. I gave the example in class of the chair, and everyone that speaks English, of course, would call this image a chair. And we would call it a chair because it appears to be a chair. It appears to serve the basic function of sitting, and it also has certain chair-like characteristics that would distinguish it from another kind of sitting device, such as a sofa or love seat, that would distinguish it from another sitting device, such as a stool. We have here, of course, two other chairs, two sitting devices that would qualify, again, as chairs because of certain characteristics. Likewise, this image would qualify as a chair. So we carry around in our minds this concept, although there are many different kinds of chairs, types of chairs, but we have this abstract image or idea of what a chair is, certainly. Think of concepts, by the way, in terms of abstractions. They're abstract images. And we can talk about levels of inclusiveness and levels of concreteness or specificity. So if we're at the specific level, we're certainly more precise in what it is that we're talking about. And as we move up the ladder of abstraction, we become increasingly more general or inclusive in our conceptual language. Consider chair as a type of device or apparatus by which we sit down. But of course, there's other kinds of devices that would allow us to do this as well. Chairs as sitting devices. Sitting devices are simply one type of furniture. So we're moving up the ladder of abstraction as we go to furniture. Under furniture, we would not only have sitting devices, but also tables. Under chair, of course, as we move down the ladder of abstraction, we'd be talking about particular kinds of chairs, office chairs, dining chairs, and other kinds of chairs, lazy boys and whatnot. We'll be looking at, of course, throughout the semester, many different sociological concepts. Social class, crime, ethnocentrism, prejudice, racism, discrimination, and so forth. Sociological concepts, however, rarely have physical reference. And this makes it a bit harder to observe and measure them. We can't just point to something and say that's what it is. Like if we're not clear about what a chair is, we can do that and point to it, and we then know. Sociological concepts are typically mental constructs, ideas that we infer from observing behavior. Because they're much harder to observe and measure, therefore we talk about operational concepts when doing research. A broad concept that we might use in theory, we, of course,
attempt to reduce to its research terms how it can be measured. So research concepts are commonly operationally defined. That is, the concept is defined in terms of how it is measured in the research study. If we're interested in measuring social class, which we commonly use in sociology in a very broad, general, abstract way, in referring to a category of people and families and groups and such that occupy a similar level in a stratification system, the class structure of a society, and share given kinds of scarce and valued resources. But how are we going to then know how precisely to place people in given social categories? What are the criteria that we're going to employ? For example, might we say that we're going to use in our survey a question or questions dealing with such criteria as a person's occupation as an indicator of a social class? We will find generally that doctors are in a different social class than truck drivers or nurses, or might it be education that we're going to employ and make inferences from education or occupation about one's social class position? Or are we going to employ levels of income or levels of wealth and ask in our research questions about a person's income, how much they made in a given time period? There are many ways of measuring a broad theoretical concept such as social class. And in each study, we're concerned precisely with how we're going to measure it. Another way, we might ask people what class they believe they're in. Do you feel that this is a valid way of measuring social class? We might present them with a list of categories: upper, middle, working class, lower class, and then ask them to identify, or maybe we could leave it an open-ended concept idea, rather an open-ended question, and ask them to identify which class they believe they're in. Getting back to theory, as mentioned, a theory consists of concepts that are linked in the form of propositions. When concepts are employed in research, they're treated as variables. And a variable is anything that can vary, such as eye color, green, blue, brown, etc. Social class, upper, middle, lower. Race, black, white, brown, red, yellow, other. The variable to be explained in our study we call, of course, the dependent variable. And the variable that does the explaining, that we're holding to be the cause in our relationship, is the independent variable. So if our variables are longevity or length of life and social class, which is which? Which would be the independent, which would be the dependent? Probably make more sense to talk about social class as affecting length of life or longevity, right? The higher the class position, specifically, the longer one lives, or the greater the likelihood of living a longer life. Let's turn to an example of a theory, and for purposes of this video, let's devise a theory of longevity. Now, normally, of course, we go through a lot of brainstorming, a lot of thinking about factors or variables or causes that might influence a phenomena. but I'll just cut that short for the sake of brevity, and we'll simply outline several factors or variables that would lead to variability in lifespan or longevity. And so I have it here, a simple model of factors, variables that are linked together in propositions that collectively are explaining longevity, or I'm attempting to explain longevity. So I have our variable social class directly influencing longevity. And of course, the higher the class position, we would propose generally that the longer the life. And this might be due to any number of factors, right? Could be simply the fact of greater income and being able to eat better, to live in a better place, a cleaner, safer environment. It also might mean that you would differ in your risk-taking by social class. So social class would also indirectly affect longevity through the variable of risk-taking, that you'd be less likely perhaps to smoke cigarettes or engage in risky behavior like engaging in interpersonal violence or whatever. Sex, whether one is male or female, might affect longevity. It might affect longevity directly. Maybe it's just the case that women are healthier than men, or females are healthier than males. Or indirectly, females are more likely to seek out health care, be more attuned to their bodies, and go for regular preventive checkups, which might then discover diseases in their earlier stages. Women have a better health status, perhaps, for whatever reasons, of taking care of themselves better. And these factors, we would argue, would collectively influence in some way length of life. By the way, what kind of variables are risk-taking, health status, and health care? We note that they're between these variables, sex and social class, that social class affects risk-taking. It might affect health care. It might affect health status. Likewise, sex influences these three variables. What kind of variables are they? We call them intervening variables because they literally intervene between our independent variable, in this case sex and social class, and our dependent variable, longevity. So the effects of social class might be direct or indirect through risk-taking, which then affects longevity. So intervening variables. We have our theory, which consists of propositions which, of course, interrelate or join concepts in some type of causal statement. Theory is transformed, or rather propositions which are within theory are transformed into hypotheses through conceptualization and operationalization. We further refine those abstract, kind of fuzzy concepts that we are talking about in general theoretical terms into researchable terms, variables, operational measures. And then we develop our hypotheses. So this transformation from proposition to hypothesis simply means taking terms that may be quite broad, inclusive, vague, and specifying operational concepts or operational measures, also called indicators, and then finding and collecting data for these particular measures that serve as an operational concept for a theoretical concept. So if we're interested in looking at the effects of social class on longevity, we might look at occupations, a person's occupation, and also see what impact that has on how long they live by virtue of looking at the date that they died. If we take the date they were born, the date they died, we would have then a very clear, distinct measure of length of life. Moreover, the question arises, where might we collect such data? Perhaps we could go down to the county courthouse and look at death certificates. And that would, of course, have date of death and also date of birth, so we could get a precise definition of longevity there. And then we would find also, probably in most states, what the primary occupation of the person was during their lifetime. Were they a teacher? Were they a truck driver? What was their occupation? And by virtue of that occupation, which serves as a measure of social class, and by virtue of the precise date of death, of course, which serves as the indicator of longevity, we'd be able to test that proposition through this particular hypothesis. Or we might use another indicator or a different indicator of social class. We might use education to reflect one's class position, differentiating, for example, between college graduates and non-college graduates, or those with professional degrees as opposed to those with just college degrees, or those with high school degrees, or those who dropped out, perhaps. So education might serve as our criteria for social class, or maybe education and occupation together, we might in some way combine them into a composite variable. So at any rate, we take propositions and we transform them into hypotheses. And essentially this is done by deriving measures for those theoretical concepts. And through these measures, then we can directly collect data and test the proposition. Of course, we're always concerned with the validity of measurement. For example, does occupation really validly or accurately reflect social class? Does age at death, as defined on a death certificate, accurately reflect or measure longevity? Likely that this is a pretty valid measure, right? On the other hand, you might have more of an argument as to occupation being a direct measure of social class. Is social class defined largely by one's occupation, for example, or are there other factors that go to make up a social class? At any rate, validity is always of concern, and we attempt to derive, of course, valid measures. So we go from theory as a collection of propositions attempting to explain some phenomena. We transform those propositions into testable statements or hypotheses. And then we move down the ladder of abstraction to observation. And of course, we move by virtue of designing an instrument, designing a sampling strategy, and actually then going out and observing, sampling and observing. So we're at the most concrete level here, right? We're out in the world and we're collecting data. We're observing. And this is where various techniques come into play. How do we make those observations? How do we gather the data? And I think your textbook has a pretty good review of the various ways that we can make observations or collect data. Many sociological research studies use survey data. A population is sampled, and then researchers go out and perhaps with a questionnaire ask a series of questions and collect data through that technique. Or we might directly observe phenomena. We might just go out in the world and view behavior as it's taking place and directly record in some way that behavior. Or we might become involved in the phenomena. We might become involved in the group, and by virtue of that participation as a member in the group, derive particularly rich understanding of behavior within it. Participant observation. A lot of research is conducted by simply sitting down with people and talking with them in an in-depth fashion, particularly people who know a lot about the phenomena that we're interested in. So we might have lengthy, in-depth interviews as a way of generating knowledge. Although psychology tends to use the experiment very often, sociology employs it much more rarely, although there have been some interesting sociological experiments, as we'll see when we talk about several a little later on this semester. Another very valid way of collecting data is through content analysis. We might be interested in looking at how the nature of television programming has changed, particularly with regard to some category or group. Has the portrayal of African Americans or Latinos changed dramatically? How about women in commercials? Has the programming in that respect changed dramatically? Have women become less defined in terms of their homemaking and commercials, and more defined in terms of things be outside the home? You might look at diaries, or you might look at other forms of content, such as music, to derive certain ideas about change. Secondary analysis involves taking existing records, existing data, and employing that for purposes of analysis. A lot of information is collected by the U.S. Census Bureau about the population of our society and population of our cities, such as San Antonio. And many researchers just take this existing data and employ it. Your textbook uses the term interpretive framework. And the interpretive framework is an attempt to understand the social worlds of people and groups in a particularly intimate, first-hand kind of way. And certain data gathering techniques are clearly best for this purpose. I would submit that participant observation certainly provides us with an interpretive understanding, as might direct observation or even in-depth interviews. These three kinds of data gathering techniques would be particularly helpful in getting into people's social worlds. And that kind of data is typically descriptive, and it may not exactly fit the outline that I'm presenting here in terms of theory and hypothesis and sampling and so forth. It takes a bit of a different strategy. I just wanted you to know that, however, that the research process that I'm describing here might not be directly in tune with these kinds of data gathering devices or strategies. So we move again from theoretical propositions to hypotheses, to collecting our data, And then we begin attempting to generalize. We generalize about the data, right? We attempt to see patterns in the data, and we look at relationships between variables, all for the purpose of deriving general statements about our evidence. And we do this, of course, through data analysis and statistical analysis. So we find data that appear in this configuration. On our horizontal axis, our x-axis, we have schooling in terms of number of years, and then on our vertical axis we have age at death, ranging from young adulthood all the way up into old age. Each of these stars are people in terms of the grade level that they attained, and the age of death. So we have this person here who has a 4th grade education and died in their late 60s. This person here who has an 8th grade education who died somewhere in their early 80s. And so it goes. We have a person way over here who has graduate or professional school education well beyond simply 4 years of college, who died in their early 40s. So if we had a pattern in our data like this, what would that say about not just the relationship between schooling and longevity, but also the relationship between social class, if we're using schooling as an indicator of it, and longevity? Of course, the data don't look supportive, do they, of that hypothesis. In fact, the greater the schooling, as we go from low schooling to high levels of schooling, longevity decreases. So we see this general inverse relationship occurring between those two variables. Or what if we found through our data collection and then resulting data analysis something like this pattern, where the people are distributed all over the place with regard to level of schooling and age at death? That would likely lead us to the conclusion that there was no relationship between schooling or social class and age at death, right? Or what if we found something like this? Now this would lead us to a quite opposite conclusion than we've discussed already, right? We see that as education goes up, so too does age at death. So people with more schooling tend to live longer. And if schooling is our criteria or our indicator of social class, this would suggest that social class and longevity are indeed related in the way we earlier predicted. So this would provide us with empirical support, right, of that proposition that we advanced about social class and longevity. So with our empirical generalization, we now, of course, can comment intelligently about our initial theory. And we engage in the process of interpretation or qualification. If our findings, for example, about education and longevity are not as we predicted, of course, this would lead us then to qualify our earlier ideas in our theory about the relationship between class and longevity. So empirical generalization is necessary, of course, for us then to really test our theory. It's necessary to have these broad empirical generalizations in hand before we can comment intelligently and perhaps revise our theory into conformity with our actual observations. Now, this, as you can see, with the ladder of abstraction, is an exercise in abstract thinking. We're going from the general, the inclusive level of theory, all the way down to observation. And we're, of course, going in a way that involves precise steps, from proposition to hypothesis, engaging in operationalization to reduce our theoretical concepts to ones that can be measured. And then we're, of course, engaging in data collection and testing that hypothesis through data and statistical analysis, which allows us as well to derive empirical generalizations, which then, of course, feed back into our theory, perhaps modifying it or rejecting it altogether. This half on the right side, this part, is called, in the language of logic, deduction. We're moving from general principles or general ideas, theoretical ideas in this case, all the way down the ladder of abstraction to observation. We're moving deductively. On the other hand, on the left side of the diagram, we're moving from observation up the ladder of abstraction to generalization, based on that observation, empirical generalization, to a broad, inclusive level, in this case theory. So we're engaging in the logical process of induction. We often hear of those terms in everyday speech, deduction and induction, and certainly they're operant here with regard to the relationship between theory and observation.